Hi, this is John with Wisdom for the Church. Thank you for tuning into the channel. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. And as always, thank you for watching. All right, well, welcome to Wisdom for the Church. Welcome back to Wisdom for the Church. I am here with Jeff Wright for our monthly or so convo. Jeff, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Just finished up a church meeting and thankful to be back on here. Always enjoy our times together, so looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Discussing the news with Jeff Wright. I just like the way that sounds. This is so awesome.
Niche evangelical news hour. That's fun.
Yeah, for all the 2 people that care about it, I guess. Well, you have you've switched back. So you've gone from kitchen to office to kitchen. You're back to the office. You are a mobile man. That's one thing that's impressive.
I will travel. Yeah, I'm. Anywhere there's a USB port, man.
Oh man, a man of few needs and a crowd pleaser. Well, yeah. Last time we maybe would have touched on some of the background a little bit of what we're going to talk about in this episode. We're going to talk about something called the Antioch Declaration, and last time we mentioned some things about pastor and ministry leader Joel Webben, and that he was involved in some controversy last month and maybe the month before. But the Antioch Declaration, I know you've read through it a few times. I'll give here, I've kind of written out what, for those who wouldn't have seen what it is, a basic description from what I can tell of what it's supposed to be. A signed statement crafted by multiple men and now signed by probably hundreds of people. Yeah. So the Antioch Declaration is a declaration with the purpose of clearly laying out and warning about growing sinful ethnic pride and the type of scapegoating anti-Semitism that is antithetical to the gospel. And these concerns of this type of thinking, the concern is that these type of attitudes are coming more from the political right and even maybe theological right. Those 2 things do have obviously some large interactions. So that's on its face, to give what the Antioch Declaration is on its face, what this is about. We see this growing anti-gospel movement of anti-Semitism, maybe even like white kind of nationalism. I don't know if that was explicitly as much in it, but it seems to be a part of it. Yeah, and I do want to say this too, before I'll kind of get your thoughts, that there are some people that are signing this really quickly, some that are saying, even if it's a good statement, I don't have to have a gun to my head to sign something that's not like a gospel reality. And there are some that are more, hey, I'm not going to sign this thing. And I know that one factor that's gone into some pumping the brakes to not sign it is how Joel Webben in the past month or 2 has been painted. And he's been painted, some would say the well has been poisoned. Basically that Joel has been presented as someone who has helped usher in some of these ideas, or at least does not speak out against them. These ideas that they're presenting as, hey, this is sinful, and we think that Joel Webben has been to use one term that I think Doug Wilson used, a revoice for Nazis type of guy. And so Joel Webben has been seen as part of the problem and even part of someone who is at least okay with sin. And from what I've seen publicly, I don't think that Joel truly, like my opinion is that he has any anti-Semitic beliefs. He does believe that there are certain sin patterns that manifest based on Judaism and its particular showcase, like in our nation or in the West. But in terms of like any sort of ethnic reality, I don't believe that Joel has any sort of racism to him or anything that I've seen. I've seen that his public statements seem to be okay if they're taken in context. And even when he says things that he would admit, I shouldn't have said that, he seems to be pretty quick to publicly repent, which is one thing that seems to go unnoticed. So anyway, that's one reason why some are not. Probably the main reason that a lot of people actually aren't really signing it. First of all, is just they think this seems really close to that Joel situation. That this statement about the things they're saying that Joel is doing has come out, and they're saying this is unfair. And I would argue that to Joel it was unfair as well. But yeah, overall, I know you've read through it a couple times. You told me. Thoughts on the surface of the Antioch Declaration. What did you first think when it came out? It's been out probably a couple weeks now. James White, Doug Wilson, a guy named Tobias from Germany. I'm not going to try to
pronounce from the Ezra Institute, Joe, who maybe?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I was kind of caught by surprise when it came out because, I heard, nobody's under obligation to tell me about these things. You just kind of tend to hear about new declarations coming from major evangelicals before they're actually trotted out.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard this. There had been some online chatter between like James White and Tobias and Joel about, well, we're going to give a full answer to some of the lies that Tobias had told. We'll deal with that later. And it looks like the Antioch maybe was the statement that they were referencing, but I didn't expect it to come in, a formal please sign here declaration. I read the thing the first day, and you already mentioned, like, it comes from guys that I've learned a lot from, held in high regard for a long time. Before I was a Calvinist, I did not like James White. When I became a Calvinist, I really liked James White.
Yeah, it's kind of one way or the other with him. Yeah, just
right.
The personality. So
right. And Doug Wilson, I've learned a ton from Doug. Been very appreciative of Doug. There's just multiple things that are in my life that he's got a strong handprint in from a distance, and so these are men I respect. I don't know much about the Ezra Institute guy. You mentioned Pastor Tobias. It's wild to me they let him be an initial signatory. It's pretty clear at this point the guy willfully, intentionally planned and executed to be deceptive about Joel before he went ahead and did so. And so I thought that was a misstep. The document, I'm not sure how many of your viewers will resonate with this, but as a guy who's watched and listened to James White and Doug for a long time, mm-hmm. I feel like I can tell which parts of the document they specifically contributed to. Like I'm like, oh, this sounds like a Doug. I guess my overall statement here is, or my surface 1,000-foot view is that, anti-Semitism ought to be opposed. It also needs to be defined, and I think that's where a lot of the trouble around this statement has come, and with Joel and all this other, right? It's like racism. I know about 3 different definitions of racism. 2 of those I don't think are accurate. Systemic racism, things like that. Ethnic partiality gets close to the actual definition, but you ought to define it. You need to define your terms, which Doug knows and James knows.
Yeah.
But they don't do a lot of that. And so that leaves me with a summary of the statement that, okay, it's good to oppose anti-Semitism. I'm in favor of that. But it's a very muddy document. I don't think it's particularly clear. And I think that it's got weird turns of phrases that really don't belong in confessional documents. The first, I can't remember if it's a denial or an affirmation. Maybe it's a denial, but it says, we deny that modern political issues can be evaluated through the seating positions of the French Revolution. I don't know what he's talking about. And
it's very specific, yeah.
What are you going after? That's the lead paragraph in your document. And I get that not everybody is going to be as uninformed maybe as I am. But it's just strange to use those kind of references in a confessional document you're expecting people to sign.
Sure.
I had a hand in the statement on Christian nationalism. We took real pains to say if we're going to ask people to sign this, they need to know what they're signing. And so there's just numbers of instances throughout the document where I'm like, man, if I sign this, what am I signing? What am I agreeing to here? And knowing James, who's a regular communicator, and knowing Doug, who wrote a book on wordsmithing and I've taught his rhetoric textbook. I just feel like they could have communicated more clearly. And I honestly don't understand why. I don't know if it was a rush. I don't know if some of the lack of definition gave rhetorical wiggle room that they find useful. I just don't know what to make of it because these guys are better communicators than this.
Sure. Yeah. And are there any other places that stuck out in your mind or that you remember off the top of your head where you're just like, that I don't know exactly what they're saying, or the term needs to be explicitly defined in order to know exactly what sort of idea they're talking about?
Yeah. Another example that kind of leapt off the page at me when I was reading it is when they get to, I think they're alluding to a specific number of casualties in the Holocaust, because that's one of those the people who are called anti-Semitic are accused of like lowering the number or pretending like there weren't that many Jewish people killed or whatever. And they come right out and say that, but that it seems like that denial or affirmation is really addressing that we can trust the established historical record.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of it, they say, and this is, I think I'm pretty close if this isn't an exact quote, basically if we don't take the established number, we are attacking the science of history.
Okay.
And
I kind of remember that a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, it's that phrase, the science of history, that kind of grabbed me because, I guess I feel like I have an obligation to just say I don't have any interest in challenging whatever the current number is. I'm assuming it was whatever the historical.
Million.
Yeah,
usually it's way here.
Yeah, that's fine. I have no reason, and I really don't spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not I would challenge that. This is just not my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But I do think a lot about history, and I really honestly don't know how to talk about the science of history. I don't even know. That's just strange phraseology. So Doug wrote a book, Black and Tan, that kind of went after the historical narrative around Southern slavery. What was he attacking the science of history when he did that? What do we mean by the science of it? There's that Norm Macdonald joke that, it looks, thankfully every good guy won every historical battle. And it's kind of referencing that idea that history is written by the conquerors, right?
Yeah.
And so
paints them in the best light, usually the conquerors or the winners painted in the best light.
Yeah. And so, I'm a participant in a historical faith. It's basically the most well-established historical fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. We can know history accurately. But the idea of the science of history, particularly coming from guys who spend a lot of time being like, well, the dominant historical narrative that you learned in the government education system or, in popular conversation isn't quite accurate, to see them lean into the science of history struck me as really odd. I don't have any reason to question the Holocaust numbers, but I'm also not acting. I just know too much to know that history is not objectively fixed the way that many scientific conclusions are.
Sure.
Right. And of course, science is going to be a process of testing hypotheses and coming to new ones. I get all that, but like we know what the freezing temperature of water is in a way that it's just weird to talk about.
Once history's done, you can't measure it. You can't bottle it up. You can't test it. You only can go to source documents that you hope are accurate, basically. Right. And that's about as good as you can do.
And those new documents might, there may be new documents that show up.
Yeah.
Think about the Qumran discovery.
Mm-hmm.
One ready example, if anybody's been kind of paying attention to this, Daryl Cooper, who kind of does his stuff under the handle Martyr Made, went on Tucker Carlson's podcast several months ago, and he made a really provocative statement. He said that Winston Churchill was the bad guy in World War II. Well, of course, that's going to grab a lot of attention and whatnot. But his criticisms of Churchill sounded very credible in his analysis and working with the documents. Well, it kind of created this histamine reaction. Churchill's a beloved figure in Western culture. And, I've heard guys like Al Mohler go on and on extolling the virtues of Churchill. I've never really had a reason to question any of that.
Sure.
Whatever. But I have listened to a lot of Martyr Made's long-form podcast stuff on history. His series on Jim Jones is incredible. And he's clearly working with primary texts. He's not ham-handing his way through this. Well, if challenging Winston Churchill as a moral exemplar is an example of attacking the science of history, I don't think the idea of the science of history is all that useful because, I have no interest in seeing Churchill torn down, but I do have an interest in having an accurate historical perspective on him.
Sure.
Which is what I think history, when it's done at its best, is supposed to provide us.
Yeah.
And so I just found it odd that we're not, the text seems to imply you're not allowed to question dominant historical narratives that are in fashion in your day. Again, you've got an author who's done that and faced severe criticism for it with the American Southern slavery phenomenon. It's just odd. I feel like the whole document reads really odd, and that's this is a long answer to your question.
Sure.
But that one really jumped right off the page at me the first time I read it. I kind of snapped back, like, what are we talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, you got to a point early on, which matters with anything you're doing, is that defining terms matters. Yeah. And again, I would have to go back through the document because I did think there were some good points in it. There were some things that I would say, on a surface level, oh yeah, absolutely. Like I like the way they said that. But, if it's about, anti-Semitism, then that needs to be very pointedly defined so that when someone is clearly not being, that they're given the benefit of the doubt, or we can actually, define, what this is when someone is committing that type of a sin.
Right.
And, with the Joel Webbin situation, again, I think him just saying some things that he believes to be true about current sin patterns in our day gets him tossed in that bucket of anti-Semitic, or at least sympathetic to it or something like that. And now you've got a problem because now you're not representing him fairly.
If you want to give your audience an example, so let's say questioning and maybe even rhetorically trying to lower confidence in the established number of how many Jews died in the Holocaust. Okay, so that's anti-Semitism.
To believe, you might not be going here, but to say, anti-Semitic, I believe is an initial error.
Yeah, so
because it's like, I'm not saying I hate Jews. I just think it could be 4 million.
Right. So that's got to be on the table, right? Like, again, I have no interest in questioning it. I have no reason to question it.
I don't want to lower it. I'm just saying it might be.
And there are probably people out there who do want to lower it and dismiss it as inconsequential because they have racial animosity towards Jewish people in their hearts. All that's on the table.
Which is terrible. For anyone watching, do not paint us the wrong way. It's terrible.
Right. Absolutely.
Disclaimer.
But it's just part of the ecosystem of humanity, right? So even if we just kind of grant and say, okay, if you want the lower number, that's anti-Semitic. We'll put that under the anti-Semitic umbrella. Does saying Churchill is a bad guy, is that anti-Semitic? Is saying Stalin killed more people than Hitler, which I've seen, I haven't ever evaluated. Is that anti-Semitic? Several months ago, when the DOJ was going after Christian nationalists, there were some pretty prominent figures on social media saying that Christians should stop saying Christ is king because reasons. and one of the reasons was that it was anti-Semitic. And it alienated our Jewish neighbors. And I remember thinking, that's the central confession of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
It's a synonym for Jesus Christ as Lord. is that anti-Semitism? Right? And so it's anti-Semitism is sort of like the racism bucket. There's a legitimate way to talk about that is appropriately dealing with moral failures or moral victories.
Yeah.
But man, we gotta know where the parameters of the bucket are, like what's in and what's outside of the bucket.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it's so poorly defined in the document, I think is a major misstep. Pat Buchanan basically said, if you call, I can't remember the exact quote, but he said, if you call a man a racist or a Nazi, that's a convenient way to dismiss his ideas.
Sure.
And man, we've been living through this since the dawn of wokeness. These are buzzwords that are used to shut down politically deplorable people advocating for their own positions. So I have no desire to do injury to contemporary Jewish people about an atrocious part of their history. I just spend very little time thinking about the Jews as a people group. But I do think about things like hate speech rhetoric and the way it's been leveraged against people exercising just free speech.
Yep.
And so I start to get real nervous when we're anathematizing certain terms or certain ideas under this derogatory term when I'm not entirely sure everything that's tried to be crammed under there can legitimately be done. And in some ways, I feel like the Antioch Declaration is feeding some of that.
Yeah. So definitely two things are going on with entering into a declaration like this and entering into the conversation. Number one is defining terms. And then number two, based on even terms being defined, there is then the question of, okay, so how big is the problem?
Yeah.
As well. And so I'm not going to sit here and say that none of this is a problem. I think there are people that are clearly anti-Semitic out there. I think there are people that are white and have ethnic hatred, if we're trying to use the best kind of biblical definition, partiality, hatred in their heart for people that are non-white. There is some of that, but...
And Muslims seem to clearly hate Jewish people as Jewish people. I mean, right? So like...
Yeah.
I'm aware of the spectrum here.
Yeah, but the question is it the massive problem that it's being presented as? I would think that the answer is no, based on some of the things that I've seen that are like, oh, well, that person, he was not saying anything that he hates Jewish people ethnically or whatever ethnically. He was just saying here is a certain sin pattern that is manifesting in our day and age. And generally, this people group right now is the one that commits it. Like if I were to say something like, we have an addiction, like in America, white people have an addiction to individuality and achievement and making their name great over family. In general, I think probably, like, if I'm going to say that's my people group, and it's probably too large and wide to really say that, but if I'm just going to say that that's my people group, probably white people in America fall into that more than other ethnic groups.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying I hate white people because I'm saying that. I'm just saying, hey, here's how a particular sin pattern has made its way into our people group due to various cultural factors. And you know what I mean?
Like the Indian caste system and the way that it reflects an assault on the dignity of every, image bearer. Or a very similar phenomenon is still well within the Overton window. Who were the people riding around in white hoods lynching people in the Deep South? Can we talk about them as predominantly white people? I think we can.
Yeah.
To contrast,
and you're not saying I hate white people by saying that.
Right. Yeah. To contrast that, and again, this is context outside of the Antioch Declaration, but it goes to your point that, like, there are people who have trepidation about this document because of the context in which it was birthed. Doug Wilson had an episode this last month where he and his children came on and talked about various things. And at one point, a rhetorical point came up that I have seen on social media quite a bit. I don't know how many porn websites there are. There's going to be more than this, but let's say there are 10. And, I've seen people say, 8 of these websites are owned by Jewish people. Is that a problem? That's a problem.
Yeah.
So Doug, in addressing that, said, why are you worrying about who owns the porn site? Why aren't you worrying about the Gentiles who are going to watch porn on those websites?
The answer is yes.
Exactly. And like, so is noticing, that's a loaded term, but is the idea that, we know that a disproportionate amount of these sites are ran by a particular ethnicity, is talking about that anti-Semitic, is wanting those websites shut down, which are major revenue streams for them. Is that anti-Semitic? Why can't we talk about both? Why can't I say these guys shouldn't run it? And it's odd that one ethnic group maybe has a majority of those websites, and also say whatever the demographics of those websites users turn out to be dominated by one ethnic group, that maybe there's a problem there.
Yeah.
It seems like special pleading. And really what it reminds me of is when Christians talk about immodesty. Mm-hmm. And usually immodesty we're talking about with modern feminine culture. Mm-hmm. The response is often, well, why are the men looking? Yeah. Why are the men looking? Yeah. For sure. That's a problem. But if that's a defeater, if we're talking about also the choices that women are making and how they present themselves, well, that's a non-starter too. We're going to talk about both. And so it's just odd that Doug seemed to really want only one side of the conversation and kind of put the other in the unacceptable bucket. And again, it goes back to the definition terms. Is that anti-Semitism? I can't believe it is. I think it's anti-porn. And while I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-porn.
This is an anti-porn channel too.
Right.
Official anti-channel of the internet.
It tends to be a Christian position.
Yeah.
I think Joel has gotten some clips circulated where he talks about the rabbinic commentaries that talk about Jesus being boiled in hell in excrement. And he's saying, look, there's a stream of Judaism that's particularly hostile to Jesus. Here again, is that anti-Semitic? Or is it just, in some ways that's doing the science of history, right? Like Jewish religious leaders wrote that. Can we talk about it? Can we say that maybe that represents a problem in the religious tradition? Because again, Doug will be very clear to be like, the Greek Orthodox guys who so many young men are turning to, their icon kissers, and they think that walling themselves up in to death is spiritually virtuous. Well, yeah, that I agree that's a problem with that tradition. But if I can talk about the Greek Orthodox guys looking up to people who walled themselves up till they died, I should be able to talk about a Jewish rabbi saying Jesus is burning in hell in a pit of excrement. And again, it comes back to special pleading. Why is there special rules?
That is there's a good point there. There was one, I do want to at some point, give some credit where credit's due in terms of the things that are, I can agree with this. But one thing I did write down, or I thought that I didn't agree with, is one of the denials was toward the end. And the reason I don't necessarily agree with this is because if I substituted any other religion or philosophical group, I would not agree with it, if that makes sense. So it's the denial is
substitution is very important. Swap out another group and see if it still works. That's a wise evaluative tool.
Wisdom for the church. Let's go. We deny that Jews are in any way uniquely malevolent or sinful, that Judaism in its multifarious expressions is objectively more dangerous than any other false religions, or that it represents an exceptional threat to Christianity and Christian peoples. By nature, the Jews are objects of wrath just like the rest of us, which is condemnation enough, and are equally recipients of God's grace. And references Romans 11 through 32. That last sentence I would give a hearty amen to. The Jews are objects of wrath apart from Christ, just like the rest of us, and in Christ are recipients of his grace. And so I have no, in and of myself, spiritual good that is better than a Jewish person, for all of sin and fall short. What I do object to is the first half of that statement, though. The Jews, we deny that they are in any way uniquely malevolent or sinful, or that Judaism in its expressions is objectively more dangerous than any other false religions, or that it gives an exceptional threat to Christianity. I don't necessarily know. I mean, you mentioned some rabbinic traditions that seems pretty explicitly anti-Christian. But if I were to substitute another philosophical or religious system in there, I believe that we should not flatline morality and flatline sin completely, though ultimately it is sin against God, and even one sin is worth condemnation to hell apart from the mercy of Christ. But, there are some religions. If there were a religion in my town, like religion A and religion B, and religious A was a group that once per day would throw 5 children into a fiery pit to appease a god or gods or whatever. Let's just say 4 gods, just for fun, 4 gods. And then the other side was, okay, maybe I'll say Judaism, or maybe I will say a group of atheists or something. Though both are damnable, I believe that this one commits some more atrocious sins in the public square. And so I don't believe that I can flatline and say, well, there's nothing uniquely malevolent or sinful in and of themselves before God, like ontologically. Absolutely, I agree with that. Like, a person who's born on the other side of the world is not uniquely ontologically worse or better than I am, but his sin is going to show itself in different ways, and he might be in some way like worse than I am, and vice versa. So that's what I would disagree with, because now we get to the point where we're flatlining sin, and I think at that point we really can't talk about any unique sins almost at all that manifest publicly without basically calling one another racist or anti-Semitic or whatever. Thoughts there?
Yeah, if I take your meaning, what you're saying is that certain religions have, or at least hold the potential to have, different consequences of the specific ways they express their unbelief. And if we're going to say they're all equal, you can't really talk about the unique ways they do it, right? So, it's common in right-wing circles from a certain generation, people who were in their young to mature adulthood when 9/11 happened, for people to say, well, Islam's a uniquely violent religion. There's lots of religions out there that are hostile in certain ways, but man, they really seem to turn to extreme violence pretty quick. Well, that's not what the Antioch is saying about the Jews, but it is operating on a principle that would flatten those things out unless we treat Judaism as a special non-Christian religion, which I fully grant there's a lot of push towards. I mean, I'm from Schofield Bible-dominated part of the country. The idea of the Judeo-Christian tradition has a lot of traction around here. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that we can't criticize the Judeo side of whatever tradition we're talking about there. And again, if I'm understanding you rightly, I'm with you in that we can talk about unique features of religions that may hold in common with lots of other religions, that they hate Christ. I don't want to offend any of your listeners, but there are streams of Seventh-day Adventism that I think are inconsistent with the gospel. There are some streams of Seventh-day Adventism that God's done a really great work in, and I think they're brothers and sisters. They've just got some secondary and tertiary problems. If I had a healthy Seventh-day Adventist who's wrong about when the Lord's Day is, I will prefer that to Roman Catholics who practice scourging as a religious rite. Mm-hmm. I do. I prefer that. I think that's better for my neighbor, that they be wrong about going to church on Saturday than Sunday, as opposed to lashing themselves and wearing hair shirts. So here again, I'm not willing to be constrained with a scare term. I'm very willing to think about a well-defined term. And then, these are the features of that when it expresses itself. I'm very happy to have that conversation. But to just have it floating around as a general condemnation,
sure,
I just can't I can't submit to that.
Yeah. Yeah. If there were a group of cannibals, I use cannibalism for some reason a lot in my examples, but like if there were a group of cannibals that were growing in influence in a small town of 30,000 people and people were starting to disappear, I believe that it would be fine to say that that is a uniquely malevolent or sinful threat to our churches right now, for example.
Well, yeah, and
Though it's not the only threat.
And we can
Obviously.
actually do this in a real world way. So the temple of Satan that says abortion is one of their sacraments, and they provide legal religious exception coverage for people who want to kill their children in the womb. I'd rather have a synagogue in my town than the temple of Satan, for sure. This is not hard calculus. And so, if Judaism has unique features, and it does, we ought to be able to talk about it in the same way comparatively.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I was thinking about as we were talking is we want to use, because I think that there were two primary issues, in my opinion, with, we'll say, social justice, wokeness, whatever you want to call it, cultural Marxism. One is unequal weights and measures. I'm holding this group to one standard, this group to another. So I believe that in this conversation, hopefully we're using equal weights and measures and saying, based on God's standard, some people have this sort of sin that tends to dominate them and it dominates them more than it does other people, and vice versa. But we're using the same standard. The other thing that I think maybe got less press or less articulation with wokeness within the Christian circles is it's not just wrong because it was partial and prejudiced, though it clearly was. Unequal weights and measures held white people to a way different standard than anyone else, a terrible standard. But it was also untrue. That's another big part of, I think with this conversation is part of what the objection was to social justice is you keep saying that these things are true, particularly of white people in America, that, like everything is biased toward them. You look at the reality and you're like, okay, so we're standing in a college that on the wall says abolish whiteness. And next to that is the door to the multicultural center for scholarships for specifically non-white people. This is a bag of crap, basically.
Right. And their enrollment department has decided that ethnic minorities don't have to have a certain SAT score that majority students do. I mean, it's bearing false witness about an entire society.
Yeah, and there are certainly sins that do hit various ethnic groups differently. But the things that you kept saying, particularly about white people, are like, a lot of times that's not the truth. And quite honestly, it's the opposite. We have a pretty weird problem, especially back then, of bending over backward to worship people that are non-white. Like that's a real sin pattern. Partiality against white people was a real and is a real sin pattern. With this conversation, when it comes to talking about different sin patterns that just show themselves in different groups, I don't think that, we're always wrong when we're saying, like, for example, you mentioned the porn industry, that it tends to be, weirdly enough, it sounds like it's dominated by high level, I guess, Jewish men. Like, we can talk about that, and that's actually a true thing. And so I think that's a difference. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but you've heard the term probably, woke, right? And it's like, well, you're doing the same things. You're talking about this or that, and it's like the difference is I think that we're putting our finger on real issues that are actually happening in space time and real sins, not false ones. Any thoughts there?
It is true that correlation does not necessitate, if I can say it, correlation does not necessitate causation. So a phenomenon can be expressed in certain individuals in a way that is coincidental rather than revealing some kind of root cause, right? So it could be coincidental that whatever percentage of porn sites are owned by Jews, and it really has nothing to do with Jewish ethnicity, which I'm pretty sure it doesn't, or even Jewish cultural assumptions or biases or particular sins. But is it anti-Semitic to ask if it maybe that, like if it's a line of inquiry? Are we doing anything to cultivate that? So, again, the parallel would be something like the Jim Crow South, where white Southern Christians doing something that cultivated a low view of the dignity of African American neighbors. That seems like a very acceptable enterprise for students of history to investigate. It seems like it should also be appropriate for students living in contemporary history to say, well, is there any kind of causation in these dynamics? But for some reason, that's often pushed as anti-Semitic. And again, I mean, just to come back to your point about unequal weights and measures, double standards, special pleading, it seems unjust to say, well, the one is okay and the other is really a product of racial animus that's morally reprehensible. Yeah.
And with, getting back to definitions that matter and everything, I think it's a helpful lesson for everyone, including, me and you, that when we are not charitable with our definition, or when we're not narrow in terms of actually defining what we mean, and therefore giving charity to someone else when they're speaking or, living, to see what are they actually saying, that do not judge lest you be judged. That standard will probably come back to haunt you as well. Like if you, fall into the sin of bearing false witness by misrepresenting someone, such as potentially using like anti-Semitism as a false, like, or as a sloppy definition, that standard could be used on you, maybe in a different category. But I saw this happen on X, not Twitter anymore, but X. With a lot of things being said, written, whatever about Joel Webben, and I believe that overall he was misrepresented as someone who is kind of neo-Nazi adjacent, who has explicitly said multiple times that, hey, I hate racism. I do not have racial animosity toward others. I actually think that this group over here is a real example of anti-Semitism, for example. But, Doug Wilson has obviously been opposed in this area to Joel. And I saw a kind of a retweet, a quote tweet or whatever from Owen Strawn of Doug, basically. And he basically said, like, Doug, did I not say that this was going to happen? This is what happens when you are for example, a Christian nationalist or whatever. And it's like, that's a sloppy standard, because Doug does not actually argue with his idea of what should happen politically in a nation. He does not argue, and he argues against there being any sort of like ethno-state or, racist state. And yet Owen says, see what's happening with Joel, Doug? This is because of your ideologies. And so now the same standard that Doug, I would argue, is kind of sloppy toward Joel, Owen is using that same sloppy standard in a different way against Doug, basically saying, like, if something happens and it happened to be in your neighborhood, that's because a direct result of you. Or if someone quotes something that you say and they quote it falsely, that's on you. It's like, well, no, that's on the person who's taking, myself or whoever it is out of context. But I've seen some of that happening where it's like, that standard that you use to potentially misrepresent someone, it's going to come back to bite you, because there's nothing to stop someone else from poisoning the well around you and making you look like the big bad wolf or whatever.
Yeah. And again, I'm someone who's followed Doug for many years. I've followed him long enough to know that the rhetorical tactics that the Antioch coalition is using to paint Joel as an anti-Semite are the exact rhetorical lines that were used to paint Doug as a racist for what he wrote in Black and Tan. And he laughed that off and said that's ridiculous. And honestly, he was right when he was doing it with the accusations of racism against himself. And so it's odd. That's probably the best way I can say it. Disappointing is another. To see him just take that tool bag and aim it at a good brother on equally baseless grounds. And yeah, guys like Owen Strachan are going to run with that. You know, he's trying to get Owen is trying to get Stephen Wolf's book canceled, which, you know, it's crazy to me that guys want to burn books and think the other guy's the Nazi, but that's what he's doing, you know? So yeah, this is, you know, I don't want to do too much speculation, but this is just such a head scratching move. I can't help but think that somewhere along the lines, Pete Hegseth's nomination to Secretary of Defense has got to be somewhere in Moscow's mind. He, you know, famously in classical Christian education circles, Pete wrote a book on classical Christian education, and he has his kids in the CCE school, and Moscow's heavily invested in that field and has been a leader in that field. I don't know if they're trying to insulate him by doing this. If that's the case, you know, there's a Girardian section of the Antioch Declaration where they say that it's immoral to scapegoat any individual or group of people as, you know, uniquely evil or whatever, right?
Yeah.
They've scapegoated Joel Webbin. So you know, the principle they're saying it's evil to do this to the Jews, it's also evil for y'all to do it to Joel. And if there's something on the back burner that's like, well, we gotta protect Pete from political accusations of being associated with anti-Semites, it's still immoral to scapegoat Joel. You know, that it's politically important now that you have access to power. I mean, I'm not someone who has access to power, but it's still immoral. And again, that's speculative. But this document is so weird that any thinking individual has to come away from it and go, what in the world is going on here? And so it just invites thinking through, like, well, what could be motivating this? And then also, why can't you see how you're failing your own principles? There's another one. I don't mean to go on this thread too long, but there's another one that says that pastors are obligated to protect their sheep from wolves and their congregations from wolves. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
But the way that they use the lies of Pastor Tobias against Joel on the basis of a way he shepherded a member of his congregation, Tobias is the wolf. Joel's protecting his congregation from Tobias the wolf. So could you maybe enforce your own standards in your inner circle and stop expecting Joel to do it when clearly on the objectively available evidence he did a better job of it than you've done? Those are the kind of troubles that this document raises, and I'm just befuddled by it. The guys who created it are smarter than this, so I'm left wondering what got them here. Yeah.
And if you've befuddled Jeff, something's up.
Well, I don't know.
It's
not a high bar.
It's not a high bar. Okay, good to know. And you know, we've, like you said, you know, about a minute ago, a lot of the last 2 minutes or something, though it was not unworthy or anything. Some of it's speculation. Like, I don't fully know exactly why every last thing was written. So for the average person who ended up, you know, signing this document that probably doesn't necessarily know nor care about any of the specifics of like a particular pastor over here and one in Germany and what went on, you know, like you and I might be a little different on this based on you being able to kind of see through some lines. But for me, it's like 85% of what I read there, 95 maybe, I'm like, yeah, okay, good. Yeah. So I do think that some people can sign it like in good conscience, and they really are just trying to say, hey, I'm against anti-Semitism, even if there's some things they haven't thought through, or maybe they're not looking at the fact that, oh, yeah, this definition is a little too loose, or what do they mean by this, or why do they just randomly mention Aristotle's name?
Yeah, that's another.
In
That's
there,
another
like, so there's definitely some interesting things. But if you're just kind of reading through it once and you're like, oh, of course, I can understand that happening. I can also understand people that just don't want to sign it for principle because they disagree with certain statements in it, like the maybe flatlining of sin thing, or they just. I feel like there are some people that are like, hey, I'm not going to get in the middle of another statement. I know what God's standard is, and so fine, make your statement, but I'm not going to do it. And there are some that have more principled reasons of why they wouldn't sign it, and I think there is some room on all those fronts, to be honest. I did want to give... Yeah, go ahead.
I just generally agree with that. I mean, if some guy, again, we're using the term anti-Semitism. If there's some guy out there who saw the document and thought, yeah, I want to make sure my voice is speaking against arbitrary animus towards Jewish people as an ethnicity, I don't have any, I have no rebuke for that guy. He's just trying to do what he thinks is best.
Sure.
I do think that we would be wise. I think the document suggests that we should be pretty careful in thinking about, and probably need more work on, what is anti-Semitism. The document assumes it, doesn't define it. I don't want to beat up on brothers who went ahead and signed it. That's fine.
Yeah.
I just think the document suggests we probably ought to be doing a better job defining it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that's a good synopsis there for sure. I wanted to give, and you can give me just feedback on these once I read them, just some credit where credit is due in terms of just some examples of things that I read and thought, okay, that was helpful, and I just sort of picked out like 3 or 4 things, and there were actually quite a few for me. So some of the good, they do touch on and define well a lot of important truths, such as, though you mentioned it, our tendency to scapegoat inappropriately. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't know what's in the head of every last one who made the statement, but we do have a sinful tendency to scapegoat inappropriately. I know I do at work. Like, oh, it was that person's fault. Like, that was actually my fault. So they hit on that.
Rene Girard is great on that, and I know about Rene Girard because Doug cited him, and his idea of the social scapegoat is a really helpful interpretive lens to view culture through. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm thankful Doug put that guy in front of me. I just think maybe in this case he's actually doing some scapegoating, but the statement itself is good.
Yeah,
he's right.
Yeah. So yeah, we do have that tendency, even if you kind of wonder, I don't know about the politics behind it all. I thought this was helpful. In the reality that in our time of disillusionment, many will gravitate toward charismatic and strong people. And I don't know if they said that or if I paraphrased like statements I saw in it, but they mentioned that.
For sure.
And I think there is truth to that. Like in our reality, which is dominated by confusion, postmodern, up is down, down is up. A man can say he's a woman, and therefore we all have to say he's a woman. Those sorts of things. Many will gravitate, therefore, because of weak men, charismatic, strong people. Andrew Tate being a perfect example of that.
Yeah, that was in my
The
mind.
only reason Andrew Tate exists and has power and influence is because of the failure of good men to rise up and be influencers, basically, and influence their sons.
Yeah. So I don't want to will actually everything in this document because I'm like you. I want to affirm what's good. And you're right. That's a legitimate point. I immediately thought of Andrew Tate. Like he exists because there's a vacuum of authentic masculinity, particularly among evangelical Christians. But guess what? There's a lot of people moving to Moscow, Idaho, because Doug is a forthright, masculine individual, and they gravitate towards that. And so, like, there's a version of it that I'm very thankful for. I'm glad that people are leaving Seattle to move to Moscow and be part of a better church because there's an actual man leading the charge. I don't want that with Andrew Tate, but I'm thankful for it with Doug. And so, I don't want to well actually all of it.
you ever seen the show Adam Ruins Everything?
Yeah.
No, actually,
Yeah.
but you're a much better version of that. So don't worry.
I'm trying not to be, but I'm just pointing out that this is kind of the sloppiness of the document. Like, a few more sentences about this is appropriate when the man who is gathering a crowd is seeking virtue defined by Christ's kingdom or something like that. That's actually good. We want more of that. Mm-hmm. But we don't want Andrew Tate. And so this is why the document feels rushed, or I called it muddy earlier. These guys are clearer thinkers than this. I don't understand why there weren't more, why it wasn't more carefully crafted.
Yeah, and I guess that gets at to one of, we've talked about it multiple times, but if you wind the clock back like 5 or 6 years ago, there were actual like social justice in the gospel kind of a statement. There were actual prominent figures that led churches or led a seminary that were teaching things publicly that you could actually point to this person's name and say, here's what they have taught and done. And so it kind of gave context into, we affirm this, therefore, and don't affirm this, because you've seen, okay, this is really happening, even though many would say at the time, oh, this is crazy. What are you talking about? Aren't you against racism or whatever? And so I think with this, I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, or there's just not, I missed the news, or like I don't run in certain circles or whatever, but like the circles that I had run in 5, 6, 7 years ago was like, it was a palpable social justice-y impulse, like to the point where it's like, yes, this is definitely actually happening in large swaths. This one, like when it's talking about, but we deny this, there are times where I'm kind of wondering, in what pockets are you actually talking about it?
Absolutely.
That's something that,
That even gets to the nature of the problem. So, like, authentic ethnic animus towards Jewish people as an ethnicity is a problem. How big a problem is it? And so, when I see it on the fringe. I see it with anonymous social media users with no followers. Mm-hmm. In contrast to like the woke stuff, where major leaders, as you said, of evangelical institutions are using those institutions to promote those ideas. That's a much greater problem. Nearly infinitely more in terms of threat assessment. One has major institutional power in evangelicalism, still does.
Yeah.
The other is a fringe phenomenon. And so, like, even the idea that we've got to aim a statement at it, it's such a big problem. Mm-hmm. I feel like it legitimizes something that is not nearly so significant. And I don't care to minimize anti-Semitism, and maybe there's some way to measure that it's a much bigger power. Maybe there's seminary heads who are just, really excited about Hitler. And I don't know.
I didn't want to bring it out earlier, but like, if there were a statement, and I'm not saying it's this level at all, but if there were a statement that was like against transporting dwarfs into space or something, that would be, it's like, well, we need to be against this 100%. Right. But I am wondering how big of a problem it is. And I am not saying that this is to the minuscule problem of either the height or the problem of dwarfs being shot into space.
Right. It's completely absurd, though, right, to illustrate the point. Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we're on kind of the same page that are wondering about that.
MLK 50 as a conference was insane in terms of pushing wokeness. Now, I'm not laying all that at MLK's feet. I'm just saying the conference itself was a vehicle for pushing crazy woke nonsense. Yeah. We've not seen a Hitler at 100 conference or whatever the comparison would be. And so
it's terrible.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not showed up. which makes me think that maybe it's not a comparable problem, right?
Yeah.
It's much more fringe.
I should not laugh at that, but that's just
it's another appeal to it's an appeal to the absurd. The absurd should make you laugh. And so like I laugh when I think like of a seminary president. Right? I mean, I know seminary presidents who were encouraging their faculty to teach that the country was systemically racist and favored white people. Yeah. I've never heard of an evangelical seminary saying, I want to encourage these professors to teach that the official narrative of the Holocaust and the number of fatalities should be questioned and should be considerably lower.
Yeah.
And so the idea that it warrants this kind of whatever seems to legitimize the problem far beyond any way that we can see where the problem actually exists at scale.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. And I do pray we don't see that conference. It'd be a tough one.
Yeah, right. I will draft I will sign 2.0 of the Antioch Declaration when that conference gets booked.
And they did. I'll give one more, of which again I thought there were legitimately many. Even if you don't think about any potential politics behind it, the statements in and of themselves, it's like, no, that was well worded. Some not as much, but this one I thought was well worded. It goes back to the idol of diversity. We deny that the Church of Jesus Christ in its particular local church, has any compulsory quotas or assigned ratios for ethnic mix. The makeup of any local church community will be dependent on many sociocultural, lingual, regional factors. There is no requirement that any congregation, quote, look like the New Jerusalem. But we further deny that a Christian congregation has the right to arbitrarily exclude any person based on prejudice, malice, or bigotry toward their ethnic group.
I would sign that clause, wholeheartedly. And
is your church multi-ethnic became 5 years ago, basically the standard of, is your church sanctified?
Mm-hmm.
Or is your church doing the Christian life well? And it's like, wow. So that trumps living in truth and love. That trumps the sovereignty of God. Incredible how we just substituted that. So I thought that
standard was never applied to ethnic congregations. As a pastor of predominantly white congregations and participants in those, I heard that lecture all the time. But I would go sit in on, the Latino Pastors Fellowship or African American. They were never told to diversify their congregations and look like New Jerusalem. That was nonsense. They've been run out of the room.
Sure. And if someone had come that was not of that ethnicity, it's like, well, welcome. Sure. We're gonna teach the truth to you and allow the Word of God to work. I know it's a crazy thought, thinking the Scripture is sufficient to work in people by the power of the Spirit, but we're gonna do that. So,
well, I also just want to compliment you that you found the part of the Antioch statement. I have no temptation whatsoever internally to gainsay.
So you're not going to actually that one?
I'm not going to actually that one.
Wow.
That was well written. Yeah.
We made some progress on that one. There we go. He 100% signs off. You heard it here. He 100% signs off on the entire Antioch Declaration based on...
Maybe a little bit of an overstatement.
Well, I don't know if I had much more than that. I thought this was relevant. I thought some who end up watching this may not have heard of the Declaration, but it is faith statements and things like that are a part of obviously our historic faith, and none of them come up in a vacuum either. And so, something to consider. Yeah. But any last thoughts?
Appropriate topic. No, man, I'm just tired of my tribe fighting with each other. There have to be divisions among you. Now, that's written to the Corinthian church to show who is approved, and that's true of, broadly speaking, movements too, man. But I don't know who started it, but that no more brother wars, I'd really like to live in no more brother wars. You don't see this kind of infighting on the left.
True.
I wish we didn't have it on the right. I think it's It's one of the things that actually helps, that stops us from moving the ball forward in a way that honors Christ.
Handling sin and sin and or, because sometimes it's not just conflict, is such an exercise in our growth as men, including for myself. It's just and so much of it I've learned in my life comes down to me, in terms of, as far as it depends on you, live peaceable, with all, and sometimes that's going to end in a beautiful reconciliation, or the ability to know where you stand on different things that are of minor significance, but you keep working together. And sometimes it's going to end where someone says, I'm done with you or whatever. But when there's constant reactionariness going on, it's like, oh man, this is not going to work. It's sad when there's talking past each other at times.
Yeah. And I don't know what the antidote is, but it's just unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, brother, that was a fun one. The news with Jeff Wright. Yeah. Again, I love the ring. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, brother.